In the previous video, you saw that John's 7 prophecies in chapter 14 had nothing to do with the standard explanations that you will always hear concerning that chapter. And in fact, the main focus of John's prophecy in that chapter is not even admitted to be there, despite the fact it is mentioned 19 times in 12 verses for a textual saturation of 158%. So you really have to go out of your way to ignore it. Because John makes the topic more than obvious, even if you are a somewhat intellectually challenged individual. And you saw that John's detailed explanation of 5 synchronized astronomical events all within the space of 19 minutes, makes his reference to the astronomical dating of his prophecy in chapter 14, an absolutely undeniable feature of his prophecy. All confirming, positively in fact, all the prophecies concerning Paul's man of sin and son of perdition in 2 Thessalonians, John's Antichrist in his epistles, and 666 in Revelation, have all been fulfilled in history. And you saw that 2 of the 3 most common interpretations of Revelation have actually been designed to hide these facts and its corresponding content from the public, not explain the book of Revelation, as is constantly claimed. And that is why there is a vast public ignorance concerning the real contents of the book of Revelation. And that mass public ignorance has been engineered to be there on purpose. Despite the warnings found in the New Testament about its danger spiritually, in terms of a person's own salvation. And now we come to Revelation chapter 15. And once again, we are going to come to another chapter, where you will see absolute, definitive proof that John is clearly and obviously making use of astronomical dating to date his prophecies, and that this astronomical dating will once again, without a shadow of a doubt, demonstrate that these prophecies are historical, and that the Antichrist, the first and second beast, and 666 have all occurred in history. After completely ignoring the issue of wine, in chapter 14, when Counter-Reformation eschatology comes to Revelation chapter 15, you are going to witness Counter-Reformation eschatology do the very same exact bad behaviors, in chapter 15, that you have seen throughout the entire rest of the book. And because chapter 15 is an entire chapter that John writes, that is completely focused on astronomical dating, they will usually just skip over chapter 15 with a couple of sentences, and go right into chapter 16, where John writes about what they refer to as the bowl judgments. Since it is more than obvious that chapter 15 is an entire chapter whose description is dealing exclusively with events in heaven, or as you know by now, the sky, they read the texts, then make a few allegorical symbolical ink blot statements about it. Then go directly into chapter 16. They literally have no clue what to do with chapter 15. Because they imagine it to be nothing more than John waxing poetically about their pagan Greek Nikes flying around in heaven, meaning the place of the afterlife, around God. And in their eschatology scheme, there is absolutely no point in chapter 15 having even been written. There is literally no point in John having even wasted his ink writing chapter 15. It is nothing but empty poetry to them, and a waste of words, to skip over, and quickly get to chapter 16. And when they plunge headlong into chapter 16, once again, their entire interpretation of that chapter is completely dependent on quoting bad translation into English, completely ignoring the content of the underlying Greek text. So they completely ignore the subject of wine in chapter 14. They completely ignore John's astronomical references in chapter 15. Then, they completely ignore the translation work in chapter 16, to preach their version of what they call the bowl judgments, all of which never happen until after a fictitious rapture that is nowhere to be found anywhere in the book of Revelation. And all of which occurs exclusively within a fictitious 7-year tribulation period at the end of the world, that John openly and directly says he is already currently in 95 AD. Not that what the text actually says even matters to them. But chapter 15 is a hugely important text in the book of Revelation. Because John begins the chapter by referring to what he is about to describe as a great and wonderful sign in the heavens. Here is how you can absolutely know These rapture eschatology counter-reformationists have absolutely no clue what they are talking about in chapter 15. Because they imagine every use of the word messenger, transliterated as the word angel, refers to pagan Greek Nikes. They explain chapter 15 as something that is totally in heaven, meaning in the place of the afterlife, and completely unseen on earth. But John says what he is about to describe is not only a sign to earth, but it is a great and wondrous sign. It is very, very unusual. And it is a sign. Now, if John were describing 7 Nikes in heaven that no one could even see, there is no way that could be a sign. And furthermore, if you have the vain imagination that heaven is filled with pagan Greek Nikes, flying around all the time, then there would be absolutely nothing unusual about 7 of them, flying around, since that is what they would be doing anyway, all the time. John's word, which is translated as great, as in a great sign, is the Greek word, megas, which we get the word, mega, from. Megas, means a really big sign. Not just a sign, but a really big one. A really remarkable one. A really rare and unusual one. One that makes you think. That gets your attention. That you couldn't possibly just miss. And yet, that is precisely what counter-reformation rapture preachers do. They literally just miss it. Revelation, chapter 15, establishes a very important reference for everything that will follow in chapter 16. If you just ignore or skip over chapter 15 to rush into chapter 16, you really will not have even the foggiest clue what chapter 16 is even discussing. Because John will bookend the bowl judgments in chapter 16 with his astronomical description in chapter 15. If you ignore chapter 15, then your explanations in chapter 16 will be ignorant explanations. Because that is what you did. You simply ignored what he said, going into their descriptions. Just like you probably ignored what he said in chapter 1 verse 20, when he said his use of the term messengers referred to the stars, and not pagan Greek Nikes, flying around in the sky. John does 4 specific and very important things in chapter 15. 1. First and foremost, John will date his prophecies for chapter 16. So you will know precisely when in history he is referring to. And as you will see, there will be no mistake about what, when and where he is referring to in chapter 16, because of what he will point out in chapter 15. There will be absolutely no excuse for misinterpreting his prophecies. He will actually time frame his prophecies in chapter 16 with a set of time frame bookends that places prophecies in an exact period of history. John is not just throwing out prophecies. He is making reference to exact places and times in periods of real history. 2. Secondly, John will establish very clearly his definition of what he is referring to when he says the term messengers, that he is in fact referring to the stars in the sky. 3. Thirdly, John will very clearly establish that his astronomical template, which he refers to as the 7 stars, are also, very literally, the 7 planets. Not 5 planets with the sun and the moon, counting as 2, but the 7 literal planets. You will hear it said that they could not have referred to the 7 planets, because Uranus and Neptune were unknown to the ancient world. But you will hear it claimed all the time, the ancient world did not know about things involving astronomy, that there is very clear evidence they knew about. Why and how they knew about these things is unexplainable in our current understanding of their history, but just because we do not know how they knew these things, doesn't mean they didn't know them. We discussed this in chapter 10, concerning the rings of Saturn. They had no way to know about the rings of Saturn, but they clearly knew about them, and even knew they were made of water. And John is writing a revelation, and by definition, a revelation is something that would not normally be known. It is revealing something that is unknown by definition. So it would make perfect sense that what he is revealing is not known. So that is really not a valid objection, given the subject matter of the book. In chapter 15, you are going to see definite concrete proof that John is referring to the 7 literal planets, not 5 planets with the sun and moon, but the 7 literal planets, including Uranus and Neptune. And 4, you are going to see that John's astronomical dating for chapter 15, once again, absolutely could not be invented or contrived. and it confirms the astronomical dating of everything that has gone before, because it fits with perfect precision into his already established historical timeline. With such accuracy and precision, there is absolutely no way it could be just a random coincidence. You simply could not make this up, or imagine this, and get it to work with such astronomical precision, if it were all simply the result of someone's imagination. It would be an impossibility. These 4 facts make John's writing of chapter 15 a very important part of understanding chapter 16, without which you will really have no clue what he is talking about. Which counter-reformationists do not, because they choose to ignore what John is saying in chapter 15. Anyone who cannot, or will not, tell you what chapter 15 is really about, will not have the foggiest clue what chapter 16 is about, either. Because the English translation work in chapter 16 does nothing but hide the actual text from its readers, if you do not correctly connect it to John's reference in chapter 15, you will once again miss the entire point of chapter 16. And chapter 16 does have a point. But even before you get to chapter 16, if you do not acknowledge what chapter 15 is really about, and you obviously cannot if you reject John's own instructions concerning astronomical dating for his prophecies, then you will have no clue what he is really prophesying in chapter 16. And that is why they don't. There is some good news, and some bad news, when it comes to the translation work on Revelation chapter 15. The bad news is that the translators were so clueless as to what it meant, they didn't even try to shade their translation work with any theological bias weasel words in their translations to shape how it was read. So we have a fairly clean translation of the chapter in most translations. That is the bad news. The good news is that, also, we have a fairly clean translation in most translations. So we will be able to use a standard literal translation and see the text as it really is. Which is, as you have seen in numerous videos, quite ironic and unusual for the translation of many chapters in the book of Revelation. For our exegesis of chapter 15, we will be using the Young's literal translation. And as you will see, there will be only 1 or 2 words we will need to look at for clarification in the Greek text. Even the King James Version does a fairly good job of translating chapter 15, with the exception of its continued transliteration of the term messenger. That is because none of the church board translators saw chapter 15 as anything other than poetry about Greek Nikes flying around in heaven. They saw the text as theologically inconsequential. But actually, chapter 15 is very theologically consequential. And if they had known what they were reading, this chapter would be as shaded in their translation work as many of the others have been. But thankfully it is not. Chapter 15 has only 8 verses in it. So it is a fairly small chapter. In these 8 verses, John mentions the number 7, 8 times. In the previous chapter, you saw that John gave 7 prophecies. In this chapter, he is going to introduce what are commonly known as the 7 bowl judgments. The chapter begins with verse 1, which reads as follows, in Young's literal translation, quote, "And I saw another sign in the heaven, great and wonderful, 7 messengers having the 7 last plagues, because in these was completed the wrath of God." John is clearly referencing an astronomical pattern for his upcoming prophecies concerning the bowl judgments. He calls it a mega sign. Here he says, he sees the 7 messengers in heaven all together. And we are going to discuss why this is a mega sign in a few minutes. John is going to further describe this mega sign in the following verses, which he begins to start doing in verse 2, which reads as follows, quote, "And I saw as a sea of glass mingled with fire, and those who do gain the victory over the beast, and his image, and his mark, and the number of his name, standing by the sea of the glass, having harps of God." There is one word correction we will make in Young's, which is that he uses the word harp, which was the Egyptian instrument, rather than the actual word lyre, which was the Jewish instrument used in the temple. That is why John keeps bringing it up. It was the instrument used in the Jewish temple. which most translators replace with the word harp, which was used in the Egyptian temple. That replacement is probably not accidental, as most of our translations have been intentionally polluted or corrupted with elements from Masonic esoterica, because of the influence of the Church of England. So we will correct that word, because we do want the real Christ. And we want his real temple, with his real saints, who have the lyres of God, rather than the harps of Egypt. As you saw in the beginning of the book, in chapter 4, verse 6, John references the sea of glass there as well, where he states, quote, "And before the throne is a sea of glass like to crystal, and in the midst of the throne, and round the throne, are 4 living creatures, full of eyes before and behind." End quote. As you saw there, he was making a reference to the Milky Way. There, he mentions the 4 living creatures, and describes them as full of eyes, before and behind, which were the stars. Here, in chapter 15, he describes it as mixed with fire. The Greek word is the word pour, and it is the Greek word used for flashes of lightning as well. Those are also a reference to the stars in the Milky Way. He is describing the same reference as in chapter 4 verse 6, only using a different metaphor this time. So he is clearly referencing the sky again. In verse 3 and 4, John states, quote, "And they sing the song of Moses, servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and wonderful are thy works, O Lord God, the Almighty, righteous and true are thy ways, O King of saints. Who may not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? Because thou alone art kind, because all the nations shall come and bow before thee, because thy righteous acts were manifested." End quote. Here John references something he calls the Song of Moses, and then specifies afterward that Moses was a servant of God. Then he follows that comment by adding, "and the Song of the Lamb." Biblical scholars debate the meaning of this phrase. The first debate is whether the title, the Song of Moses, refers to Exodus 15 or Deuteronomy 32. Because both texts are referred to as the Song of Moses, yet they are clearly 2 different texts. The second question in these debates, is John referring to just one song, which he also calls the Song of the Lamb? Or, is he referring to 2 separate songs, one which is the Song of Moses, and the other, which is the Song of the Lamb, thus 2 different songs? The answers to these questions are found here, just like they are for all other debates about texts of Scripture. The correct answer is determined by the context and the grammar of the text, not by our free associations. The context which we just concluded in chapter 14 was God's judgment on Rome for replacing the blood of Christ in the Passover meal. So the context is clearly the Passover. So that would mean his reference is to Exodus 15, which referred to the Passover, not Deuteronomy 32, which did not. The addition of the phrase, "and the Song of the Lamb," by the construction of the grammar in Greek, refers directly back to the Song of Moses, meaning John was including both in his reference to the same one song. He is calling it the Song of Moses and the Lamb, meaning it refers to both. So the question was, why was he doing that? Why did he have to specify Moses was a servant of God, who in his future intended audience would not know or understand that? The answer is to remember who he is prophesying all this against. He is prophesying against the future rise of the Nicolaitans. They would be very anti-Semitic. And consequently, John was already familiar with the fact they would demonize Moses in their rejection of Christ's blood in the Passover meal. So John makes a point to specify 2 things. First, that Moses was a servant of God. You cannot demonize him. And secondly, the Passover was not just about Moses, it was also about the Lamb, which was Christ. To reject the blood of Christ in the Passover was to reject the Lamb of God that was sent to take away the sins of the world. Verse 5 through 7 reads as follows, quote, "And after these things I saw, and lo, open was the sanctuary of the tabernacle of the testimony in the heaven. And come forth did the 7 messengers having the 7 plagues, out of the sanctuary, clothed in linen, pure and shining, and girded round the breasts with golden girdles. And one of the 4 living creatures did give to the 7 messengers 7 golden vials, full of the wrath of God, who is living to the ages of the ages. As we mentioned in the beginning of this chapter, in using Young's literal translation, and not translating from scratch as we have done in other chapters, we would have to make one or two corrections or clarifications, and in verse 7, we have one of those corrections. Young's translates the Greek term, phial, as the word, vile. This is an extremely bad term in modern English, because from the time that Young translated this text, until now, 160 years have passed. And in those 160 years, the term, vile, has come to mean something completely different in English, from the time that Young's used this term. Today, if you Google the term, vile, you will discover Google defines the term as meaning, quote, a small container, typically cylindrical and made of glass, used especially for holding liquid medicines. End quote. So in other words, a glass bottle. But if you look up the etymology of the term, and how it was used in the 1800s, you will discover it originally meant, quote, a flat vessel, a dish, or a flat bowl for drinking, or sacrificing, end quote. And so there are two, completely different definitions, for the word, vile. Young was using the original definition of the word, vile, meaning a flat vessel, dish, or flat bowl for drinking or sacrificing. Young's literal translation was a good translation in that the etymology of the English word, vile, which was still being used this way in the 1800s, came from the Greek word, phial, we see in this text. That is why the spelling similarity. But the problem is that the English definition has changed its meaning through common usage, so that today, when English speakers hear the word, vile, they do not think of a plate or dish or broad shallow bowl, they think of a glass bottle, which is something completely different. Thayer's Greek lexicon gives the definition of the Greek word, phial, as quote, a broad shallow bowl, or deep saucer, end quote. That is the correct meaning of the Greek term, phial, used in this text. John is describing a shallow bowl, or saucer. The reason the lexicon specifies it is a shallow bowl, is that bowls come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and today, when we think of the term bowl, most of the time, we are thinking of a common cereal bowl you would eat your breakfast cereal in the morning. But the kind of bowl being referenced by the Greek term, phial, means specifically, only a very shallow bowl, or, otherwise known today, as a saucer. We will use the term bowl, occasionally, throughout this section, simply because of the familiarity the public has with the phrase, the bowl judgments. Anyone who has grown up in a church of any kind, has heard sermons preached on the bowl judgments, and if you didn't hear it growing up in church, you will certainly see it all over the internet. That is the term the public is most familiar with, but it's actually not a very accurate term today, because the Greek term, phial, means only a very broad shallow bowl, as in our modern term, saucer. So, the current, more linguistically accurate term, would be, the saucer judgments, not the bowl judgments. In this text, John is stating that the 7 bowl, or saucer, judgments will come out of the great sign in the heavens, the mega sign. He also says that one of the 4 living creatures gives to the messengers, their bowls, or saucers. That is an astronomical reference of great importance. Because we know from John's previous references that the 4 living creatures were the lion, Leo, the ox, Taurus, the man, Aquarius, and the eagle, which was the old version of Scorpio. But John doesn't specify which living creature he is referring to. He just says, one of them. We will look at that in more detail in the next section. And in verse 8, which is the last verse, John states the following, quote, and filled was the sanctuary with smoke from the glory of God, and from his power, and no one was able to enter into the sanctuary till the 7 plagues of the 7 messengers may be finished. End quote. And in this text, John is stating that the bowl judgments will continue, until the great sign is completed. John is giving us a time of duration, marking the time of completion, when it is finished. So next, we need to understand, what that great sign really is, and how does it mark the end, or completion, of the bowl, or saucer judgments. In this section, we are going to examine John's astronomical dating for Revelation chapter 15. But, as pointed out earlier, this is the introduction to chapter 16, where John prophesies the 7 bowl, or saucer judgments, and chapter 15 provides the time frame, dating, for those prophecies. So understanding the time frame for chapter 16 is dependent on understanding the astronomical dating in chapter 15, which we are now going to look at. Although chapter 15 is only 8 verses long, because almost the entire chapter is dedicated to astronomical dating, as you will soon see, there is a lot of astronomical information in the chapter. We will begin looking at this information now, beginning with verse 1. In verse 1, John says there is a sign in heaven that is great and wonderful. As we covered already, he calls it a mega sign. It is a really big sign. He states the 7 messengers are all in the sky at the same time. As you know by now, that is a reference to the 7 planets. So we will put the 7 planets on our chart, next to verse 1. In verse 2, he gives us 4 additional markers for this sign. First, he mentions the Sea of Glass, that is the Milky Way. The Milky Way occupies a specific part of the sky, and he is referencing that part of the sky. Secondly, he says he sees those who had the victory over the beast, over his icon, over his mark, and over the number of his name. In chapter 5 verse 5, we are told this is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, or in other words, the constellation Leo. Then John tells us he sees them standing by the Sea of Glass, having the lyres of God. This is an additional reference to 2 things. The first is the martyr theme, which is used to refer to a meteor shower, as being given robes of white, in chapter 6 verse 11. So John is making reference to a meteor shower. Secondly, he mentions the lyres again, which you saw previously was his reference to the constellation Lyra, which was a lyre. So John is stating that we should expect to see a meteor shower near the constellation Lyra as well. So John has given us 4 additional astronomical markers, along with the appearance of the 7 messengers in the sky. First is the Milky Way on the horizon, the second is the constellation Leo, the third is a meteor shower, and the fourth is the meteor shower, near the constellation Lyra. And all this occurs with the 7 messengers, or planets. So that is an extremely detailed description of this astronomical event. So we will put Milky Way, Leo, Lyra and meteor shower on our chart, next to verse 2. Verses 3 and 4 are not about astronomical information, but theological information, where John invokes the subject of the blood of the Lamb in Passover again, and asserts the divine commission of Moses as a servant of God, along with the divine institution of the origin of Passover, as the undeniable hand of God. In contrast to the Nicolaitan Antichrists, who would be demonizing all things Jewish, including the blood and flesh of Christ, in the Passover meal. In verse 5, John refers to the sanctuary of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven. So what does John mean by that reference? John is citing Psalms 19. Psalm 19 is about the law and the testimony of the Lord. It has 14 verses in the chapter, but the first 6 verses of that chapter are all about astronomical dating for prophecy. And it reads as follows in the King James Version, quote, "To the chief musician, a psalm of David. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night shows knowledge. There is no speech, nor language, where their voice is not heard. Their line is gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them has he set a tabernacle for the sun, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. His going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it, and there is nothing hid from the heat thereof." End quote. As you can see, in the psalm written by King David himself, he refers to the heavens as the tabernacle of the sun, and that it utters speech and declares knowledge. That is the tabernacle John is making reference to in verse 5. The tabernacle of the sun. So this will be a daytime event. So we will put Psalm 19, tabernacle of the sun, and daytime event, on our chart, next to verse 5. In verse 6, John states that the 7 messengers will appear in the tabernacle of the sun, and be clothed with golden girdles. That is another reference to the presence of the sun. Once again, reiterating it will be a daytime event. So we will put the 7 planets on the ecliptic with the sun, on our chart, for verse 6. In verse 7, John states that one of the 4 living creatures will give them 7 golden bowls, or saucers. But John doesn't specify which one. He has already mentioned Leo at the beginning of the chapter, and now he is referencing another one of the 4 living creatures, which would be separate from Leo. When you look into the 3 remaining constellations of the 4 living creatures, one is pictured pouring out, and that is the man, Aquarius. And in the last verse, in verse 8, John uses the imagery of the Old Testament temple, stating that no one could enter until the 7 judgments were completed, indicating the duration of a timeline. Meaning in the previous verse, John is stating it will begin in Leo and end in Aquarius. So we will put begins in Leo and ends in Aquarius on our chart next to verse 7. John's descriptions of the bowls, or saucers, being golden, is a reference to the sun being positioned in the jar of Aquarius, which is like a bowl, or vial, in each of the events, which he will be prophesying. But the reason John uses the term for broad shallow bowl, or saucer, instead of jar, is because John's term was similar to the vessel used in the temple on Yom Kippur, also known as the Day of Atonement, in which blood, for the sin of the people, was poured out by the high priest. Each bowl, or saucer, judgment is described as golden, because it will be signified by the sun, in the jar of Aquarius, with the messengers passing through this position. This astronomical symbolism is extremely related to pointing to the issue of Passover, and the blood of Christ, in the Passover meal. Once again, why is that, you might ask? Because this is the sequence of events, which occurred when the Passover was instituted by Christ, as his New Testament. It comes from Luke chapter 22, verses 7 through 13, and reads in the King James Version, as follows, quote, "Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare us the Passover, that we may eat. And they said unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare? And he said unto them, Behold, when ye are entered into the city, there shall a man meet you, bearing a pitcher of water, follow him into the house where he enters in. And ye shall say unto the goodman of the house, The master saith unto thee, Where is the guest chamber, where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And he shall show you a large upper room furnished, there make ready. And they went, and found as he had said unto them, and they made ready the Passover." End quote. As you can see from this text, it was a man bearing a pitcher of water, precisely as pictured in the constellation Aquarius, which they followed to where Christ instituted the Passover meal with his disciples. And this is the very symbolism seen in the constellation Aquarius, which will serve as the astronomical marker for the entire series of the bowl, or saucer, judgments, which was the vessel of pouring out the blood on Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, in the temple. John could not have possibly been making himself any more clear as to why all these judgments would be coming upon the world, because of the Antichrist Nicolaitans of Antioch, who came to power in Rome, and their subsequent war against the blood of Christ in the Passover meal, and their replacement of the New Testament Christ with the Apollo Christ hybrid of the sun worship, which venerated the spiritual deity of the Roman Empire, born on December 25th. Worshipped in what is commonly known as Christmas, originally the Christ Mass. And these same series of judgments will not accidentally all be judgments dealing directly with the issue of sun worship, as each judgment will be marked by the entrance of the sun into the jar, pouring out, of Aquarius. And each judgment also bringing a series of disasters, all associated with direct effects of the sun. Just as the plagues of Egypt were directly connected to the worship of its false gods. And that completes John's description of the great sign in heaven. That is an awful lot of specific detail about this sign in heaven. Next, we will look at the historical fulfillment of this astronomical prophecy, and see how it creates the historical timeline for John's upcoming bowl, or saucer, judgments. When we come to the historical fulfillment of Revelation chapter 15, we come to another absolutely undeniable proof that John is using astronomical dating for his prophecies. Because the detailed description that John gives in chapter 15 can only match one event in history, and when you see the incredibly minute details of what he describes, and how amazingly it is actually fulfilled, it will truly be just as amazing as was his description of the destruction of Antioch. It will leave no reasonable doubt in anyone's mind who is honest and objective about these texts. Because you simply could not possibly make all this up and get it to fit with such complete and amazing accuracy and precision. In the structure of the book, there are the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, and the bowl or saucer judgments. As you see on the chart on your screen, there is a pause between the 6th and the 7th of each set. The 7th of each set opens the next set of 7s. So, for example, the 6 trumpets completes the trumpet judgments, and then the 7th trumpet judgment serves as the last trumpet judgment and opens the next set of 7s in the bowl judgments. So there is a sequential structure to the book. In chapter 15, John is introducing the bowl judgments in the great sign in the heavens. If we were just making all this up, it would be impossible to get this sign to just randomly and arbitrarily fit exactly, with astronomical precision, at the end of the trumpet judgments on the historical timeline, because obviously, no one would have any control over where this event might occur on the historical timeline. And when you understand how completely rare this sign is in history, you will realize how amazing John's astronomical prophecy really was. Because the orbits of the planets occur at very different distances and speeds, and their orbital circuits are spread apart at very different time frames, from as small as 88 days to as large as 81 years. It is virtually an impossibility that they all occur in the same sky at the same time. In fact, it is so completely rare that, if you Google the question, 7-planet alignment, Google search will return this response under its People Also Ask section from the online BBC magazine, sciencefocus.com, quote, "Because of the orientation and tilt of their orbits, the 8 major planets of the solar system can never come into perfect alignment. The last time they appeared even in the same part of the sky was over 1,000 years ago, in the year AD 949, and they won't manage it again until May 6, 2492. End quote. 5 and 6 planetary alignments can occur every 100 or 200 years. But 7 and 8 planetary showings in the same sky are so rare. The last time they happened was 949 AD, and they will not happen again until 2492 AD. That is a span of 1,543 years. Literally over a millennium and a half, or 15 centuries, in between. The mega sign, or great sign, John is talking about, is an extremely rare showing of 7 planets in the sky at the same time. And that happened in 949 AD, over 1,000 years ago. And it will not happen again, for another 470 years. And that is precisely the kind of great sign, or mega sign, that John prophesied in Revelation chapter 15. But, remember, John prophesied a number of astronomical details about the occurrence of this sign. He didn't just say there would be 7 planets in the sky. As rare as that actually is, he said there would be 7 planets in the sky, with Leo, with the sun, with a meteor shower, and the constellation Lyra, and that is all pretty specific stuff. If this event in 949 AD was in fact John's mega sign, it would have to occur with all this astronomical detail as well. And not only that, it would have to fit into John's astronomical time for the transition from the trumpet judgments to the bowl judgments. And furthermore, not only would it have to begin with Leo, as John describes, the second occurrence of this event, in 2492 would have to end in Aquarius. What are the odds that all these conditions would be met in this extremely rare astronomical event? So what happens when we examine this event in 949 AD for John's astronomical markers? Here is what we discover. On your screen is the day this event occurred in history. when we look in the skies of the city of Rome, we find our exact astronomical markers on August 18th. As you can see, there are the 7 planets all found on the ecliptic in the sky, and precisely as John prophesied, the Sun is present with the planets, and it is located in the constellation Leo, once again, precisely as John prophesied. And you also see the meteor shower in the lower portion of the screen, and the constellation Lyra, ascending into the sky, precisely as John described. The Milky Way emerges into the lower left-hand portion of the screen, just over the horizon, literally fulfilling every astronomical description John gave about this event. So there is no question, this is the event that John was describing. But that is not all. Remember, John also prophesies it will end in Aquarius, and that the upcoming bowl judgments will be marked by the occurrences of the Sun in Aquarius, with the messengers, with the exception of 2, which he will specify in chapter 16, as you will see when we get to that chapter. So when we look at the occurrence of this very same sign in the year 2492 AD, do we find John's astronomical markers, as he prophesied in chapter 15? On your screen is a screen capture of May 6, 2492 AD. As you just saw, there are the 7 planets, and, right in the middle of the 7 planets, precisely as John prophesied, there is the constellation Aquarius, ending his time frame for the great sign. But, if this really was the astronomical introduction of the bowl judgments, then it would have to fit exactly at the end of the 6 trumpet judgments. And what are the odds that that would be the case? But if you had been following the historical timeline, with astronomical dating, shown in the previous videos of this series, this is what the great sign looks like on the historical timeline. And this was the historical timeline for the trumpet judgments, in chapter 9. As you can clearly see, the year 949 AD fits perfectly at the end of the 6th trumpet judgment, and right before the 7th. In other words, the great sign in the heavens could not have been timed more perfect. It fits right into the historical timeline, exactly where we would expect the introduction of the bowl judgments to come. And what are the random odds that all this would fit together as perfectly as it does? You could not make this up if you tried, because these details would not fit together as perfectly as they do. So we have an amazing timeline of duration for the bowl judgments, given in Revelation chapter 15. Because, in verse 8, he states the duration will continue until the judgments are complete. So the next occurrence of this sign marks the completion of the bowl judgments. And this occurs in the year 2492 AD, marking the end of the bowl or saucer judgments in history. Because of John's amazing astronomical prophecies, in Revelation chapter 15, we have a beginning and an ending point for John's bowl or saucer judgments that he spells out in even more amazing detail in chapter 16. As you saw in the previous video, while God's judgment was brought upon both the cities of Antioch and Rome, which were the eastern and western seat of what John referred to as the beast, the city of Antioch was completely destroyed. The city of Rome, however, was not. But what John will be prophesying in chapter 15 and 16 is that the final phase of God's judgment against the Antichrist Nicolaitans will come in the destruction of the city of Rome, in the same extent that the city of Antioch was destroyed. But this destruction will come at a much later date, at God's appointed time. And the destruction of the city of Rome will mark the end of the age of the Antichrist in the earth. In chapter 15, John is going to once again stress Rome's offense in its crusade against the blood of Christ in the Passover meal. Or in other words, its rejection of the blood of Christ and its substitution with something that is not him. We are about to enter into the section of texts in the book of Revelation that bring us into present-day prophecy and into things which will constitute the future. The value of knowing the truth about current-day events can literally mean the difference between life and death. The lies that counter-Reformation eschatology spread in order to hide what has been done in history leads them into all sorts of twisted deceptions and false claims concerning our present world. And some of these lies can be deadly. They can cause you to reject reality, even when doing so could lead to financial ruin, serious injury, or even death. Which has actually really happened to many victims of counter-Reformation, rapture theology. Most people see no harm in either believing in or spreading lies, especially when it comes to religion. Because the world's version of what it calls Christianity has taught since its beginning in Antioch that lying is useful for religion and should be used to benefit itself. If you have a religious tradition that sees lying as useful rather than as a sin, or rather than moral or ethical deficiency, then no one will ever see anything really wrong with lying. This problem, however, means that the more people hold this view, the more business, professions, governments, and societies will become transformed into practices of habitual lying, and its leadership will be made up of liars. Most people do not really understand how profoundly this change affects a society. Consider how lying can affect you. When you go to a doctor, do you want your doctor lying to you about which drug you should take? Because maybe the drug he is giving you is not really the best drug for you, but the one which he will make the most money off of. Would you want your doctor to be lying to you and compromising your health that way? Do you want the policeman who stopped you in a traffic stop lying to the judge about what you did or didn't do? Because his department has a traffic ticket quota for the month, and he just needs to fill it. Do you want the pharmacist lying about the expiration date on your medication, or perhaps the level of medication used to prepare the drug, because he needs to cut costs or make more money? Do you want your grocer to put food on the shelf, even though he knows it's expired? What about your teacher at school or college, lying to you about facts in class, just because they want to promote a certain view that favors their belief system? Do you want someone lying to you and selling you a dangerous vehicle with faulty brakes that they know could kill you? What about a military general lying to the nation about the strength of the enemy because he doesn't want to look bad? What about your business accountant lying to you about your books because he doesn't want you to stop using his services? That could actually end you up in prison. Lying is a dangerous and destructive practice, and when it is accepted as the norm, the havoc it creates in every sphere from one's personal life to society as a whole will suffer. But most of all, when we come to the New Testament, we read that not only does lying harm everyone, including the liar themselves, and it is something that God has condemned, we also read that failure to properly love and respect truth as an idea, on its own right, is dangerous enough spiritually to lead to a person's eternal damnation. People that do not have a love for the truth are said, in no uncertain terms, in the New Testament, to be apart from eternal salvation. And that is as serious as an issue as it could get. There is no compromise with deceit in the New Testament, especially when it comes to the issue of religion. Deceit and religion are a deadly combination that are literally said to lead to the end of a person's life in damnation. So deceit and religion are not something anyone, no matter who they are, should be playing around with or tolerating. And yet, as you have seen, 2/3 of the theological universe, when it comes to the book of Revelation, are premised on the goal of hiding the content of this book from the public. And the people who spread these lies are paying a very real price for that deceit, not only in their personal lives, but the same price is being paid in the lives of all the people they have managed to convince and persuade, as well. And sometimes, that price is literally the difference between life and death. In the bowl judgments, you are going to discover that many of the political and religious claims, which serve counter-Reformation theology, are completely fraudulent and very destructive, not only to individuals, but whole societies. And the only way to be spared this rejection of reality is by knowing the truth about what is really going on around us. When we see that global warming is not a hoax, but the fourth bowl judgment, which doesn't wait until after everyone is raptured, but is happening right now, then we have the means and ability to make sound decisions about where we will choose to live and how we will prepare for our future. If you believe global warming is all a hoax, as the counter-reformationist eschatology preacher, Hal Lindsey, tried to tell his audience, then you will have no way to make sound decisions about your future, either spiritually, economically, or even politically. You might buy a house on the beach, because you think the sea is not really rising, or that the hurricanes will not be any worse. You might ignore the increasing dangers from forest fires to your home, because you think the earth is not being scorched from heat. You might vote for politicians who boldly promise to do nothing about the problem, or even threaten to make things worse, because you refuse to even admit there is a problem, because of the error of your theology. And these mistakes in judgment can literally become deadly to you personally. Perhaps you do not realize that part of the fourth bowl judgment is how it will affect nature. That there will be increases in viruses, infections and contagious diseases because of the increasingly warm climate. Maybe you even think a vaccination, designed to save your life and spare you from one of these diseases, is actually the mark of the beast, because it never happened in history. And so you refuse to get vaccinated, and get sick, and die from a fatal disease. As many Christians persuaded by counter-reformation eschatology just did, in the recent pandemic, by the thousands. Or, maybe you think because you have the right religion, nothing will happen to you because you are going to be raptured, so you take no health precautions to protect yourself, and end up sick, and possibly even dying. That false theology could actually lead to your actual death, as it already has, for scores of preachers, and thousands upon thousands of their followers. Maybe because you think there is no Antichrist, until after you get raptured, there is no need to value or protect the traditional American political value of separation of church and state. Because after all, why would anyone want a secular state? You might support turning the state treasury into a source of public funding for the government religions of Europe, such as the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Anglican Church, and giving them a blank check every year for billions of dollars, so they can do their religious work, just as many religious voters already have done in America. Maybe you think your church is more important than your government, so if you destroy your government for the sake of your church, that would be a good thing, because no one really needs religious freedom anyway, because that is what your government church teaches. Even though they were all founded by a man by the name of 3 Sixes, whose coming was prophesied as 666. Maybe you think that. And you would, in essence, be destroying your country for the sake of the Antichrist, without even knowing it. Maybe you think by observing the Mass, or the Eucharist, you will be saved, because it's the blood of Christ, and no one ever told you how the Council of Nicaea rejected the real blood of Christ because it was Jewish, and replaced it with something they just made up, thinking it would not matter to God, that it was a lie. And you will die, expecting to be saved, when the real promise in the New Testament is precisely the opposite can be expected. Counter-Reformation theology places every person who subscribes to it into some very dangerous situations, both as individuals and as societies. And the more dominance it has in any society, the more dangerous things will become, because it is based on a rebellion against God, a rejection of truth, and a rejection of reality. The bowl judgments in chapter 16 are going to give counter-Reformation rapture theology a serious reality check. And when we begin looking at how these bowl judgments are happening right now, in our own day, and will continue to happen into our near and distant future, you are going to see that there is no excuse for pretending you do not see what is happening right now in our very own modern-day history. In conclusion, In this video, you saw that Revelation chapter 15 is not John writing poetry about pagan Greek Nikes flying around in heaven. But rather, chapter 15 is a very important and very real, historical, astronomical dating reference for the bowl judgments coming up in chapter 16. You also saw that the descriptions given in chapter 15 describe in detail the great sign that John refers to in such an unmistakable way it could not be confused or missed for anything else in history. And that these astronomical dating references prove conclusively that the mark of the beast, the fire from heaven, the image of the beast, and 666 have all already come in history. And that Revelation chapter 14 was fulfilled in the destruction of the city of Antioch. Now in chapter 15, we see John give an actual historical timeline for his next set of prophecies in chapter 16. John's historical timeline and provides the time frame when the completion of the 7 last plagues of God's wrath can be anticipated in history. Do not miss the next exciting episode, which will begin our examination of the bowl judgments in history. Thank you for watching.